All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. We are kicking off the task force on reimagining public safety, August 7th meeting. Just a quick order of business. If everyone could please mute yourselves so we don't have any feedback on our recording, that would be great. And I should be sharing my screen with you as well. Can you all see that PowerPoint? Great. All right, so we are convening the August 7th, 2020 Task Force on Reimagining Public Safety meeting. Just a quick overview of welcome and updates is where we'll kick everything off. So the charge that the mayor gave this task force is threefold: to review the Richmond Police Department's use of force policy using the Obama Foundation's framework, to utilize a human services lens regarding calls for service and using best practices to do so, and to facilitate and model community engagement and community healing. And under that, to identify additional assets within the community, to create additional new partnerships within the community, and to understand community and officer values. And so that is the charge that has been given to this task force by Mayor Stoney. And I will now turn it over to Carol Adams, one of the appointed co-chairs of this task force, to give everyone an update on the process and progress that we've made thus far.
Okay. So good evening, good afternoon, everybody. So the setup is going to be we need to clarify the logistics and meeting foundations. And so that means that the identification of any additional members, co-chairs and facilitators. And we're going to share the dates for our weekly subgroup meetings. And then we will have bi-weekly publicly available task force meetings for when we get our technology all aligned with the city system. And it's moving on me. Okay. Okay, and so in our initial recommendations will occur within this 45 days where we're starting today. And then our final report will occur within 90 days after today. We can go to the next slide. Okay, and starting with our agenda for today, we want to welcome, it's moving on me. Yeah, welcome and provide any updates. Why does it keep moving? So first we'll have our presentation on the history of policing, where we will have Sean Utzi and Brian Williams. And then we'll have an overview of RPD's use of force, which is Chief Gerald Smith, Deputy Chief Sidney Collier, and myself, Carol Adams. And then we'll have an overview of Richmond Calls for Services by Stephen Willoughby from Department of Emergency Communications. And then we'll discuss the next steps around the subgroup meetings and the logistics. And then our meeting will conclude.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome, Maggie.
And I will just add, in terms of our process update, the task force has been meeting over the past few weeks to get ourselves organized and establish those meeting logistics, those meeting norms, establish our meeting foundation. We've identified additional members, our co-chairs and our facilitator. Our co-chairs are Carol Adams with the Richmond Police Department and Daryl Frazier with the VCU School of Social Work. And our facilitator is Brian Williams with the UVA Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. All right, so now I will pull up Dr. Sean Utzi's presentation. All right, can everyone see that presentation, that beginning slide? Just nod your heads, please. That'd be helpful. Thank you. All right, Sean, I will move the slides for you, so just tell me when you would like to go to the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I want to clarify, this is a presentation by not only myself, but Brian Williams. With that, I'll begin. I think it's important to first provide a context for my presentation to let you know that it's beyond simply the history of policing, but it provides a psychohistorical analysis of the policing of Black people. And the reason why I like the psychohistorical analysis, because I think we have to understand relationships, not only policy, but relationships of the people to the policy. And that's why it's important to understand not only the history of policing, but how that was enforced and the psychological effects it had on the community, particularly the Black community. Next slide. And the next slide. Okay, so obviously the relationship began during the enslavement of African Americans in the United States. And certainly the necessity of enslavement was multifaceted, but there was the need for control. Primarily the domination and subjugation of Black bodies would allow for an efficient and effective workforce, which was really the purpose of slavery, was to extract free labor from Black folks. And so the subjugation and domination was required, and this was effectively enforced through the criminalization of that particular group. It began during the Christian era with lots of biblical antidotes as to why Black people were enslaved and why it was somehow it was a punishment for the crimes against Noah. If we look at Genesis and the story of Noah and the sin of Black people that required our enslavement. So the very origin story that we find in Genesis actually is where we see Black people first criminalized. Obviously, it was Ham, the story of Ham. It wasn't Ham himself, but Ham's descendants were struck with a curse, and that curse included punishment. And so the criminalization of African Americans not only made the subjugation permissible, it made it logical. Next slide. And so then we have to understand that post hoc to the criminalization of African Americans, they began to imbue the idea of some natural criminality of Black people that was somehow part of the character or even the genetic disposition of folks, and therefore they required forceful supervision, and we had all kinds of laws that we'll talk about later, Black codes, that spoke to this. But the actual data has disputed this idea that African people, by their very nature and culture, are somehow more criminal and prone to violence than others. The data says that, in fact, if we look at the criminal behavior of the indigenous African people, that the rates are far below what you would find between Black Americans and white Americans. And so Silverman concluded that the idea that Black crime, that Black crime was in fact rooted in the Black experience. And I've added the notation that much of this was some form of resistance, which we'll talk about shortly as well. Next slide. Okay, so I'm a psychologist, and part of my own work requires us to kind of diagnose people and to figure out why people behave in certain ways, so we can extrapolate treatment approaches to that. But I think it's important to know that the earliest mental health classification for behavior resulted in the antebellum South by a physician named Samuel Cartwright, who coined the term drapetomania and Ethiopia's dysesthesia. These are two disorders, psychological or psychiatric disorders, that Dr. Cartwright had attributed to Black behavior. Drapetomania was called the flight from home madness, and it was applied to enslaved African Americans who ran away. Running away was viewed as a psychiatric disorder or mental illness. The other one, Ethiopia's dysesthesia, or was also known as rascality, And this is when enslaved people would sometimes sabotage farm equipment. They would shrug their work. They would resist their enslavement in other subtle ways. This also was seen as a mental disorder by the early psychiatric physicians in the country. So I think it's important to understand how the criminality of Black people has an early history, first beginning in the Christian era. We find evidence in the scriptures, and then in the early history of the country, that was kind of infused in the institution of chattel slavery. There were attempts to control the behavior, and one of the ways of controlling behavior is by first labeling the behavior as abnormal. And I'll move quickly on this. The next one is the concept referred to as the trickster. The trickster is a phenomenon that anthropologists use to describe plantation behavior of enslaved Africans who were kind of famous for their ability to outwit the slave master and the institution of slavery. Again, this was a more subtle way of resistance, but still resistance nonetheless. And the more obvious forms of resistance included insurrection and rebellion. Again, all of these were efforts to resist the institution of slavery, and the pushback from the institution was to label these behaviors as abnormal and later as criminal. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll ask Brian Williams to jump in here and to give us the introduction and overview to the history of policing in the United States.
Good afternoon. I'll be brief in terms of providing a historical overview of U.S. policing. Next slide, please, Maggie. What we see here, I highlight the journey, if you will, of U.S. policing, from its informal beginnings to the more formal establishments of police departments. If you look at the first bulleted slide, we see that the informal beginnings really began with the use of volunteers in the night watch system that eventually switched to a day watch system. That led to formal establishments when we see in 1838, Boston established the first U.S. police force, followed by New York City in 1845, Albany, New York, and Chicago in 1851, and then in 1853, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Cincinnati. And by the 1880s, all major cities in the U.S. had formally established a police department. But what we have come to really appreciate is how this evolution shifted from political to much more professional policing, but there are some regional differences that we'd like to highlight. Next slide, please. When we think about Southern policing in particular, we have to appreciate that slave patrols predated these formal establishments. And we will have some information that we'll share in the upcoming slides to kind of highlight that a bit. In the 1700s, early 1700s, you saw the emergence of slave patrols. If I'm not mistaken, 1704, which of course was much more than 100 years prior to the formal establishment of police departments within the U.S. Next slide. Now I'll turn it back over to Sean.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I want to go back for a minute, Maggie, to an important piece about slave codes. Can you go to the previous slide? Okay, yes. I think it's important, and I don't want to get too much into the history of slavery, but we have to understand that in the South, particularly, during the 1700s, in many states, particularly South Carolina, for example, where slave patrols began, that the number of enslaved Africans actually outnumbered the number of whites who lived in that state. In other states, North Carolina and Virginia, there were large populations of enslaved African Americans. And so there's a need to understand the constant fear that white Americans lived in with regard to their property, their chattel property. And so, as in many situations that we find a minority population controlling the majority population, as in South Carolina, there's always a need for a security, if you will. We see this in apartheid South Africa, that much of the policing was really a security force because there was lots of anxiety by the white population. The same is true with regard to the South. Now, slave codes were imposed as a way to control the behavior of the enslaved populations. And the slave codes were designed to control and criminalize Black behavior. They did not only did they affect the legal status of free Blacks, but they also relied heavily on capital punishment. They were right here in Virginia, there were over 130 slave codes between 1689 and 1868. So again, there was a system that needed to be enforced, and that system was aimed at controlling the behavior of the enslaved populations to reduce the anxiety of the larger white society. And again, as was mentioned, slave patrols began in 1704 in South Carolina. Again, I mentioned that South Carolina was one of the states where there were more enslaved Africans than there were white citizens. Now, there were three primary functions of slave patrols: to chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts, and to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside of the law if they violated any plantation rules. So again, this was a very structured organizational mechanism or apparatus that was essential to maintaining slavery. Slave patrols were government-sponsored forces, as well as organized and paid to patrol specific areas to prevent crimes and insurrections. Members of the slave patrols were free white men, and occasionally women. Slave patrollers could enter without permission any homes of Blacks or whites suspected of harboring slaves, or who in any way were violating the laws. In 1740, the Colonial Assembly in South Carolina had developed specific rules and guidelines for patrols, districts, and specific duties of slave patrols, which continued with only minor changes up until the Civil War. The slave patrols had a legacy for their extreme cruelty and mercilessness. White patrollers controlled the slave population through Civil War and were not completely disbanded after the Civil War ended. During the early Reconstruction, federal military, state militia, and the Ku Klux Klan emerged from disbanded slave patrols to preserve individual and societal control over African-American citizens, being even crueler than their predecessors. Keeping in mind, folks, that after slavery ended, African-Americans were no longer property, and therefore there was no interest in protecting them from violence. So there was an increase in violence, particularly by the former slave patrols, which were now militias, state militias. And again, we know the story of the Ku Klux Klan that emerged from that narrative. Here's another important dynamic to understand about the legacy of unequal protection and how that affects the contemporary conditions of policing in the Black community. There is a history of unequal protection of the law. This is very important because you have to have a belief or confidence in the laws for people to abide by them. Otherwise, they'll resist in various ways, which we'll talk about. But in the United States, there's a history of unequal protection where Blacks were victimized without having any recourse to the laws for their protection or safety, and unequal enforcement of the law, where Blacks suffered unequal treatment by the law and the courts when they were accused of criminal acts. And these facts require a degree of analysis to understand them. The legal system's historical failure to protect Black people has led them to perceive the criminal justice system with suspicion, if not antagonism. Now, this dynamic between policing and the Black community, with the historical context that we understand, I think it's important to give, next slide, I'm sorry, Maggie. And then next slide. I think I was talking, oh, here we go. One more. And one more. I forgot to tell you to advance the slides. One more slide, Maggie. We're trying to get to defiance. Right there. I'm sorry, folks, for getting ahead of myself. So it's important to understand that the historical context provides a backdrop to understand the relationship between the Black community and policing or law enforcement institutions. And I try to provide a context for the history of slavery as a backdrop, the nature of slavery and resistance to slavery, and how the slave patrols were constructed to squash any resistance to slavery. Now, it's important to understand that this relationship took several hundred years to develop and to establish itself. So its history is really entrenched in the psyche of Americans, both Black and white. It's not reasonable to expect that in a few short years, since the Civil War, and even since Jim Crow segregation, that we would expect that this dynamic would somehow magically disappear. It hasn't. There is still a degree of defiance and resistance that goes on between the Black community and law enforcement that is based on the imposition of Black criminality on Black folks. Next slide. The first concept that we should understand is defiance is resistance. As a psychologist, my job oftentimes is to understand people's behavior and not to judge it. Sometimes abnormal behavior on the surface makes perfect sense. Although the behavior may be judged by the current laws and policies to be abnormal, the behavior itself makes perfect sense. This is an example with drapetomania. Drapetomania was a psychiatric disorder that described Black people who ran away from slavery. Now, to me, the behavior makes perfect sense, but during that time, the behavior was determined to be illegal and disordered. So let's understand that. Now, defiance is resistance. Defiance is an American cultural artifact. This is not a Black thing. Defiance is an American concept. America's founding principles are grounded in defiance. Forbid it, Almighty God, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry said this, and we celebrate this today. But sometimes during slavery, this was the position of many Black people, right? They had been pushed to the brink where they would prefer death or liberty, and that was their choices in their minds. And so resistance ensued. And it happens when people feel that they have no options. There is a sense of despair that sets in. There are some studies in psychology that are on learned helplessness, whereby they shock a rat until the rat presses the bar. And sometimes when the rat even presses the bar, they still shock him. When the rat learns that no matter what he does, he's still going to be shocked, the rat just lays there and dies. The idea is that when there are no alternatives, people behave in ways that they feel are their only alternatives. Defiance theory explains conditions under which punishment increases crime. And this, like I just described with the learned helplessness theory, sometimes punishment increases crime when we expect it to have the reverse reaction. Punishment perceived as unjust, this is important, punishment perceived as unjust can lead to unacknowledged shame and defiant pride that increases future crime. Specific defiance by individuals and general defiance by collectives result from punishment perceived as unfair or excessive. This explains many of the recent events we see going on around the country. Many folks wondering why people are behaving and outraged and perhaps vandalizing property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are theories that predate all of us that explain this behavior. Sanctions provoke future defiance of law. Persistence, more frequent or more serious violations, to the extent that offenders experience sanctioning of conduct as illegitimate, and that offenders have weak bounds to the sanctioning agent and community, and that offenders deny their shame and become proud of the isolation from the sanctioning community. So you can see how that in the face of what's perceived as unjust unjust treatment, that people are actually going to be more defiant, right? And that this defiance becomes a badge of honor because it's resistance. Here's an example. I don't know if all of you saw the movie Glory, and you remember the story of the enslaved African who was played by Denzel Washington. He had ran away from his camp, the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, to get some boots for some of his comrades who had no shoes, right? He was caught, brought back, and he was whipped in front of the entire squadron. And if you notice, the most powerful part about the scene is that Denzel refused to flinch. he was being, I'm sorry, Maggie, next slide. There we go. I keep forgetting. I'll remind myself again. Denzel was displaying defiance. He was being ruled or judged by an unjust law. And his behavior was in defiance of that law. And so the more they beat him, the less he flinched. The same thing happened if we remember Roots. Next slide, Maggie. Here is where Kunta Kinte refused to say the name that he was given by his plantation owners, Toby, and they beat him. First, they cut off feet. He continued to run away. Then they beat him mercilessly. And finally, he said Toby. But the point of this scene was that the unjustness of his punishment increased his defiance at the risk of death. So I wanted to make those popular culture associations with the notion of defiance to understand why sometimes we expect people to behave one way and they behave another way, because the behavior is in reaction to unjust laws and unjust punishment. Next slide. And I'll move it up, Maggie. I know I'm taking up a lot of time. Here's an important concept called cultural mistrust. Cultural mistrust is a psychological term that describes the relationship of Black America to white America, right? It was highlighted in a few important scholarly texts, one by Francis Terrell and his wife, and the other by Cobbs and Greer. In 1968, Cobbs and Greer, two Black psychologists, wrote a book called Black Rage. In this book called Black Rage, which was on the heels of the rebellions that were going on in the 60s, they tried to explain where this rage in Black America was coming from. And they had a concept called healthy cultural paranoia, whereby they say that Black people typically, and with good reason, tend to mistrust whites. Not in the sense that this is some unhealthy psychiatric paranoia, but that is based on a historical context in which trusting whites have led to severe consequences for Black people. And so in mistrusting whites, it's actually an adaptive, healthy response to past harms that have been committed. And so he explains that in that way. So cultural mistrust is sometimes viewed by larger society as Black people having a conspiracy theory bent, that they see conspiracies where they don't exist. My own work around some of the things around body snatching, that kind of mimics the Tuskegee experiment work, shows that Black people have a real and legitimate reason to be mistrustful. So I think it's important when thinking about policy that folks don't wring their hands trying to understand why no matter what I say, no matter what I do, the community seems not to trust what we say. There's a historical context for that, and it makes perfect sense. And this goes into the whole concept of no snitching. We tend to view no snitching with the same kind of confused or befuddlement that we do with the mistrust. And we wonder why folks would not inform or tell on their community members who are committing crimes. It's not that simple. And I think it makes logical sense to everyone that, well, if someone killed someone in the community, we've had several children lose their lives. And we're expecting that the community would somehow disavow the no snitching culture for those instances. And perhaps on a moral level, I might agree with you, but as a psychologist, I understand what's going on. And that the relationship between the community and the institutions that police them have not established the trust whereby that people feel they can comply or cooperate. So it's something that I think is built in a 300 or 400 year history, and keeping in mind whereby on plantations, Black folks who were enslaved, informing on other enslaved people, understood that the consequences For even in small infractions, small infractions, the consequences could be deadly. The beatings, being sold, the options were really very deadly. And we have about 300 years of that dynamic. And it doesn't seem logical to me that that can be overridden in a mere 60 or 70 years of relative freedom. Relative. Next slide. And I'll begin to speed it up quickly now, so bear with me. I wanted to also talk about a very good book I recommend for you. It's called Cool Pose. The book is called Cool Pose, The Dilemmas of Black Manhood in America. This was written to describe the behavior of what we often pathologize around the behavior of Black males who respond to a sense of alienation, right, by creating a subculture. And the book describes the tough, fearless, aloof attitudes that many Black men adopt as a coping mechanism to deal with racial oppression, right? And that tough, aloof, fearless attitude is often pathologized with terms like toxic masculinity, thug life, et cetera, or reactionary masculinity, when in fact, through a psychological lens, the behavior makes perfect sense, and we should try to understand it as opposed to judging it, and certainly as opposed to criminalizing it. The same thing, we see lots of behavior, particularly with Black men. Perhaps they wear their pants sagging. Perhaps they wear their hats backwards. Whatever it might be, those very same dress styles are the ones that get criminalized and barred from some establishments. And wherever we think about it morally or culturally, we have to recognize that we are criminalizing the behavior of certain subpopulations of the general population, and then asking them to cooperate with us. Okay, moving on. Resistance identities. Resistance identities are very important to understand because they are created by subordinated populations in response to their criminalization and exclusion by larger society. This is hip hop to its core. The idea that hip hop became a resistance identity, whereby the lyrics, the behavior, the dress was really pushing back against society for the exclusion of folks who fit that identity. Individuals sometimes embrace criminality, engage in crimes, but that's not the essence of that identity. The resistance is really central to that. And again, the Black Panther Party, we glorify them today, but you have to realize in their day, we criminalized them. In fact, the gun laws in California were changed in response to the Black Panther Party exercising their Second Amendment rights. So again, we have to understand that there are sometimes subcultural reactions to pushback at the larger society, and the larger society's reaction is to criminalize that pushback. And that's what we've done to hip hop, and that's what we did to the Black Panther Party. They were criminalized, and many of their leaders were some would say assassinated or jailed, and there are people still incarcerated today who were part of the Black Panther Party movement. So again, criminalization of Black behavior or Black resistance is something we have to understand when thinking about law enforcement. Public Enemy, again, hip hop pushing back, trying to express that the lived experiences of Black people need to be seen from a particular lens. Next slide. F the Police, NWA, again, you see a pattern of subculture and popular culture trying to resist the larger narrative of the lived experiences of Black people. Next slide. And we're wrapping up here now. And I'm going to give it back to Brian Williams in a minute, but let me just conclude with a few more things. Labeling theory. Labeling theory predicts that being identified and labeled as a deviant or criminal produces further deviance through the process such as secondary deviance or deviance amplification. So sometimes this whole idea of throwing a baby out with the bathwater is real. When we apply these labels to people, people begin to act as if. There's another name for this. I'm blocking on it. But when we label people as deviant or criminal, it actually increases the deviant or criminal behavior of those folks through deviance amplification or secondary deviance. Very important to remember. Tupac, perfect example. Again, another example of a Black cultural icon who today is lauded. They teach classes at elite universities about this man and his music. But when he was living and he was celebrating thug life, he was criminalized. He was arrested several times. And the largest society criminalized him as an element of gangster rap, I believe was the name of that, gangster rap. Again, see how we criminalize in the moment? Another large example would be Nelson Mandela. People don't realize Nelson Mandela is a worldwide hero today. In Nelson Mandela's days, he was criminalized. He was a terrorist and was not able to travel after his release from jail because he was still in that list of terrorists. Next slide. Again, we don't know these young men. No, go back. We don't know these young men, but all of us have reactions and attitudes about them based on their dress, their pants, the gang signs, and the being in a liquor store. All these things signals about who these young men are. Again, there is a element that seeks to explain the behavior of Black men, especially through the criminalization of their behavior and their very identities. Next slide. Okay. All right, 2 more slides and I'm going to turn over to Brian. Differential reinforcement and the punishment. Similar behavior by Black and whites are punished and rewarded differentially for the same behavior. We see this already, folks. We already know, even in this country, that the early laws around rape were capital offenses. Rape was a capital offense. You would get the death penalty for rape. History shows us that punishment was only exclusively administered to Black men who raped white women. It was not, no one else was executed for rape for any other offense. And so we see that there are differential punishments for particular folks. And this results in favorable outcomes for certain behaviors, but racial discrimination prohibits equal rewards. For example, the idea that going to school and getting good grades results in getting a good job. Now that should be true. That's the American dream. Next slide, Mikey. That should be true. That's the American dream. If you go to school and do well, you get a good job. But all of us know that that's not true. Many of us who grew up in Black communities are familiar with the saying that you have to work twice as hard to achieve the same outcomes as white folks. Now, some of us take that with a badge of honor, but there's a whole bunch of research, empirical research, that shows that actually results in increased stress-related diseases that result in a lower life expectancy for Black people. The stress of having to always do twice as good, or staying out of trouble with law enforcement will provide better life opportunities. That's also not always true, but these are kind of the things that we're told. Next slide. Okay. Want to turn it back over to Brian. Take us home.
All right, as I conclude, what I'd like to do is kind of think about the evolution of U.S. policing. We provided a historical overview, but we've also had an opportunity to kind of hear the psycho-historical impact in connection to the African-American community in particular. But when we think about the evolution, there's some common ground that I'd like for us to kind of focus our attention on a bit. Law enforcement agencies have always enforced laws, but these laws have been somewhat unjust, in many instances, very, very unjust. It reflects the social construction that is targeted towards a particular population that has been marginalized and stigmatized. And that those social norms have been embedded within public policies. And of course, those who implement those public policies in the criminal justice context are police professionals. But what we have to understand too is appreciate with this evolution of policing within the US that they've gone from what I describe them as being kind of political puppets to professional actors. Next slide, please. And this is a visual depiction of that evolution, where being political puppets, they were somewhat reactive. The political pressures, because they were somewhat informal in nature. But as they evolved over the years, they become much more proactive, but professional and formal. Next slide, please. But when we think about this evolution from being reactive to proactive, from being much more informal to formal, sometimes the public might see these badges as being one and the same, particularly the African American or other marginalized populations. The badge to your left is the old Runaway Slave Patrol badge. The badge to your right is the much more modern Deputy Sheriff badge. Next slide, please. So when we think about will our past be our prologue, I think there's an opportunity for us to look back to kind of plan ahead. And what I have before you is a quote from Sir Robert Peel's 9 Principles of Policing that he wrote in 1829. And this particular principle speaks to the need for the public and the police to kind of work in tandem because they're one and the same. Next slide. So the question I'd like for us to ponder is, should we embrace and leverage this moment where we can be coactive? And not just this moment, but also we see this movement that's taking place where our society is demanding for this power with moment instead of a power over kind of past when we think about the past. So here's an opportunity for policing and for our society to go from being reactive to proactive to being coactive. And we see the opportunity right now in terms of community-oriented, community-based, communal-focused kind of public safety, if we kind of reimagine public safety, if you will, in a way much more from the political, the informal, the professional, and the formal, much more towards this kind of communal realm. At this time, that ends our presentation. Sean and I are happy to entertain any questions that you may have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Any questions? Comments or reactions?
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Brian, for that presentation. I appreciate your time with us today, time with the task force. I will now turn it over to Police Chief Smith and Deputy Chief Collier and Carol Adams, and I will pull up your slide here. One moment, please. All right, can everybody see that slide? A nod of heads would be helpful. Thank you. All right.
It's me. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Deputy Chief Collier, Richmond Police Department. Sergeant, was my sergeant. Carol Adams, officer here. And we're going to give this presentation on police department. And I know it says use of force here, but I think that if we're going to look at the police department, look at reimagining it, we got to kind of understand some of the structure. And somewhere down the line, there has to be a conversation on the structure of the police department, what we do, you know, as far as we reach out. So I'm going to touch a little bit on our structure. I'm going to touch on use of force. And then we're also going to touch on our community engagement, because our community engagement is vast. We do a lot of work, and I just don't know, we put it out there, but I just don't know if people receive that message. So to start off, the Richmond Police Department is authorized to have at least 755 sworn individuals. We currently sit at an actual staff of 731. We have an authorized strength of 128 civilians, and currently right now we have 109. And when you look at the breakdown, police department as far as sworn race and gender goes, we sit at about 33% African-American sworn officers, about 61% white officers. We also have 3.85% Hispanic officers, and then for Asian Pacific, we sit just over 3%, and then we have 0.14% of others. And when you hear those numbers, what you should know is that we are the most diverse police department in this region, in this area right here, if you compare the numbers to other people. So our department is broken up into different silos, if you will. The chief of police, Chief Gerald Smith, he is the commander, the colonel of the police department. But when we break it down, we also have 3 deputy chiefs. And in those 3 deputy chiefs, we have Deputy Chief Okleski, who's over patrol services. We have Deputy Chief William Friday, who is over business services and administrative stuff. And then myself, and I am over support services. And when I'll just give you some idea of what's under these titles. So under the chief of police, we have his general counsel. We have the Office of Professional Responsibility, Internal Affairs. There's a Public Affairs Office, and then there's a Special Projects Division. When we look at business services, that will include financial management, human resource, planning, property and evidence, records and technology, training and development. So the police academy falls under the business services. Under patrol, you'll have watch commanders. So we have 4 precincts. We break the city up into 4 precincts, and they're numbered 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th precinct. You know, 1st precinct being Church Hill, 2nd being South Side, 3rd precinct being the West End, and 4th precinct being the North Side. Okay, and each one of those precincts have a captain. They're broken down into 3 sectors, and that's how we do our sector policing and our community engagement, by keeping officers in those sectors for time so they can develop relationships in their communities. So under me, under support services, I have community and youth, and our community and youth has a multitude of programs, everywhere from our LIFE program, our PAL program, CAPS runs out of there, SROs are out of there. Our Hope unit that goes out to our homeless people are there. We run a Citizen Academy. We have the Ride Along program. We do a Explorer program, and it's a multitude of more stuff we do. And at a later time, we'll probably have the opportunity to get into that. Also under me is major crimes. And under major crimes, we handle all homicides, aggravated assault, youth and family crimes, forensics, photos, everything that deals with crimes that we investigate with detectives outside of what the precincts can do. And then I also have my special events investigation division. In that division, that's where my narcotics, computer crimes, my technology and traffic. So then I have special operations, and in there, that's where you're going to have your motorcycle, your horses, your dogs, and they handle the majority of the special events that go on in the city when we break down into doing events. So in saying that, I just want to put that structure out there so you guys can kind of get a vision of how big we are, how we're broken down, to help you understand who we are. Moving into the use of force kind of review of our policy and procedure. And remember, this is just an overview. There's a lot to it, and it probably will require questions in further detail later. But so the Richmond Police Department, when we start off, our officers are first introduced to our use of force policy in the academy when they are a recruit. That's one of the things they have to go through, and that training is based off of the policy, best practice, real life scenarios. And in that use of force training, that's going to deal with everything from mace to the asp to the firearm, and they also get trained in hand-to-hand combat. And so with that being said, we have also, once you get out the academy, every officer, including myself and including the chief, we have to return twice a year to follow up and do use of force training so we can stay current. But we actually, since 2005, we stepped it up. The state only required one course of use of force a year. In 2005, the current chief at that time changed it and made it twice a year. So we do twice a year now. And like I said, when we do this training, you know, we definitely keep aware of current events that are happening around the world, other law enforcement agencies, and we add that training in so our officers can get the best training. And with that being said, we are also accredited through the Commission of Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies. This is a accreditation. They're considered the gold standard in law enforcement. And basically what they do is they come in, we pay for the service, but they come in and they review our policies, they review our procedures, and they have standards compared to other law enforcement agencies spread throughout the country and actually out of the country. And you have to meet those standards to get those that accreditation. And we've had that accreditation now for several years. And as we go through and we update our policy, we also have a system for updating our policies that's electronic through the computer, so we can push our policies out to our officers and our staff. They're required to read these policies. They're required to sign off on these policies, and actually we keep a report to make sure they're up to date on these particular policies. So the last change to our use of force policy was earlier this year. It was in June. It was right after the Floyd incident. At the time, Chief Smith wanted to make sure the policy was clear that no one would add a knee to the head or the neck or apply any kind of pressure to the head or the neck with any other device, to make sure nothing like that happened here in the city of Richmond. But it should be noted that chokeholds are not allowed in the Richmond Police Department. It just was the wording of different was in the policy. We actually used the word of shunting the blood of breath. And so at the time we felt it needed to be clear to make sure that officers knew what they could or they could not do in the performance of their duties. So when we look at use of force, okay, we all know that officers are allowed to use force in the performance of their duties. However, when they encounter a situation where the possibility of force may or may not be used, if they're going to make a lawful arrest, the goal is for them, and they're taught to defuse the situation first, if possible, if that can help them avoid force. And that could be through advice, it could be through warning, it could be through verbal persuasions, right? But we encourage them to not rush into force, but use that as the last tactic, if time permits. Sometimes you are in situations where you don't have that time and you have to react quickly, and it changes the dynamics of what we do. But we also teach them and we tell them that they're poor tactics, right? We don't want them to use poor tactics that place them in a position that will require them to use force if it could have been avoided if they would have used better tactics. And that's where the training comes in. And that's why we train them, we drill them, and we try to make sure they understand that there are other ways to do things instead of rushing in and going in directly into force. But the force they use, okay, as part of the policy, we have a force continuum. And so in the academy, we have a cadre of officers that are either, they specialize in defensive tactics, they specialize in firearms, or they specialize in any one of our specialty weapons, okay? And we have a force continuum. And so the force continuum is usually what we use as a training mode. It's kind of a philosophy. And so the basics of the force continuum is you look at what you have to use when you get ready to use force. And remember, it starts with your mere presence, and then it may move into a physical, or it may move into any of the additional non-lethal weapons all the way up to lethal weapons that you have on your side. But the force continuum teaches the officer that it's progressive, so you can use reasonable escalation to match the aggression that you're getting to accomplish your goal, whether it's arrest, whether it's pulling someone off someone. But in that continuum, they also know that there's a de-escalation side. So as the individual or the subject that you're dealing with de-escalates in what they're doing, then we're requiring you to de-escalate yourself in the amount of force that you're using. So it's just enough force to deal with and or match the situation that you're faced with. So when we look at this, like I said, their options includes for the officers. It could be their mere presence, their verbal control, approved compliance techniques, and I'll touch on the compliance techniques later because I know that's something that people may not know. We have chemical agents, and then of course, if it reaches to that point and there's no other option, it can go all the way up to deadly force. So in short, the level of force the officer used is based on the actions and the levels of resistance of the subject or persons that they are dealing with. So as I stated, the items that an officer will have when it comes to if he does use force, it could be physical in nature, and that would be his hands or anything that's on his body. We use OC spray, and we have an OC fogger, and both of those require training from the academy for them to use. All officers are each issued the OC spray. They not are only issued the OC spray, but we were all, even going back when I came through the academy, we are sprayed with the OC spray as well. And the OC spray is the actual name is oleo resin capsule. But everyone uses OC for short, and for the civilian, it's basically mace. Our OC is not flammable. It's water-based, and the reason for that is that we have tasers, and when you have tasers, you need to have OC chemical that's not flammable to make sure there's no discharge or any type of burning that will happen. We have expandable aspartans that we used, and they're trained in those. They're short, they're expandable, and each officer is issued one of those. We have tasers, and we've been carrying tasers for the last several years. And what we do now is, last couple of years, is that if you're issued a taser, you're also issued a body-worn camera. And so this is like a dual task, because our first tasers we got, they actually had a recording device on them that will record anytime the trigger is pulled. And now we figure if we're going to give you a taser, we're going to give you a body-worn camera. If you are in a situation where you must use your taser, then we would have that on body-worn camera footage, which will help us with our use of force investigation and just gives us more information on what happened at that particular time. And then we have the firearm. And of course, there's firearms training that you have to pass and you have to qualify before we issue your firearm. If you're in the academy, you're not going to get off the academy unless you're proficient with it, just because of the damage it can cause. So when I mentioned some of the compliance techniques, for every use of force, we're required to do a use of force report. And so basically, by policy, whenever an officer uses any force other than handcuffing or normal restraint, and it's regardless of whether there's an injury or a complaint of injury, that if that officer used force other than the normal approved techniques in arresting, then that officer has to do a use of force report. And so some of those techniques could be distraction techniques. You could pinch your nose, you can scrape their arm, you could stomp their foot. There could be control holds that we teach them. It could be bent wrist, a twist lock, a key lock, or it could be, we do teach them ground fighting techniques. So if they're knocked to the ground and they're fighting on the ground, they may do a key lock from there, a chicken wing or an arm bar to help defend themselves while they're on the ground. And then we have various takedown techniques we use with the bent wrist, twist lock, arm bar, reverse, or even a foot sweep. And those are kind of approved techniques that are trained in the academy, and the officers are allowed to use those because we find that those particular techniques do not cause, it's the least amount of harm they could cause while they're trying to effect their arrest. But if an officer does get involved into a use of force situation, he has a responsibility by policy to call a supervisor. And this is if he used force, or if the person he used force on complains of an injury, then he definitely needs to do a use of force. He or she needs to do a use of force report. So the supervisor that shows up to the scene, he's responsible to do the investigation for the report. And when the sergeant gets there, he will interview the subject. He will separate the officer. He will have the officer give type out a statement to give to him. He will ask the subject for a statement. He will take pictures of the officer and the subject. If that person requires medical attention, he will make sure he or she gets medical attention, and that will be documented so that there's a record in what's going on. And that particular use of force report, once he finishes it, he'll also review the body-worn camera to see what is the accuracy in the report. Are there any discrepancies in the report? And once he signs off on it, he has to give us a recommendation from his level while he's out there on the scene. What does he believe? Is it in policy? Is it out of policy? Or are there other recommendations he's making that maybe the officer needs some additional training? That policy comes all the way up the chain to the major of the affected area. They will review it. They will sign off on it. And so that's not the end of it. So once the major signs off on it, and sometimes up the way, inaccuracies in reports, or maybe we feel they need some more information, that use of force report could be sent back to get that additional information, because ultimately the report goes to the use of force board. And the use of force board is comprised of a variety of police supervisors. And what we do is we branch it out. So we will have someone from the training academy who teaches use of force. We'll have our instructors that teach the aspeton, the taser, the fogger, or the OC spray. We'll have our legal in the room. We'll also have 2 citizens. By policy, we require, when we do our use of force board, we have 2 citizens in the room, and they get to, there's a process before they could come in through our citizen academy, which we run through community care. But once they go through one of our academies, they understand the makeup of the police department, how it works. We have civilians on the list that we'll bring in and sit on the use of force board. And on this board, while it's running, they go through each and every use of force report that has been filed in the police department. And these reports, they'll sit down, they'll play the body-worn camera video. We have the subject matter experts in the room. If they have questions, as a group, they vote on whether the use of force is in or out of policy. And they also are responsible to make recommendations. Or sometimes, as you read the report or you look at the video, you may see something that you have a question on. And sometimes those cases can require additional investigation and or go to internal affairs if someone looks at it and thinks that the force was more than just a basic use of force. Or it may be a situation where they look at it and believe that there's an officer that was in a group that didn't do anything, that officer did not use any force, and then they will make that recommendation on that also. Once that use of force board completes their review of the cases, they fill out a sheet, and that case go to the chief or his designee. They'll review the use of force. That'll be the last sign off. And if everyone concurs with whatever was recommended in that use of force report, then that goes into internal affairs to be entered into the system for filing. Now, when we look at excessive force complaints, that changes the scenario a little bit, where use of force complaints are investigated by supervisors in the field. Excessive force complaints are investigated by internal affairs. So when that supervisor shows up to that scene and it's a use of force, but he believes it's excessive force, or the subject is complaining of excessive force, that supervisor is required to call the Internal Affairs Division, explain the scenario, and Internal Affairs will make the determination and give him direction as to what they're going to do, whether they're going to respond out to the scene, start the investigation at that moment, or give him instructions on what they need done, and then they would pick the investigation up later. So when that investigation goes to internal affairs, it's kind of the same process once it gets there, but it's a little different. When they bring the officer in to interview the officer, because it's excessive force, there's always a criminal side to that. So the initial investigation is going to start off as a criminal investigation. And when an officer is investigated on the criminal side of the investigation, he has the same rights as any citizen. He can refuse to give a statement, he can plead the fifth, and then they will let him go. They will finish the investigation out. They'll do a review packet for the chief. From there, we'll go to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office to have that determination of were his actions just or were his actions unjust, and then it will take it from there. If the Commonwealth Attorney decides that what they saw was a violation of any law, they'll send that investigation back. Then the Internal Affairs Division will do the administrative side of the investigation of the excessive force. When they do that investigation, now the officer has an obligation and actually by policy must give a statement, must tell us what's going on. Otherwise, there are penalties that goes along with that. And so once they do that particular investigation, they interview all parties, they will come to a conclusion, and if it's in policy, not substantiated, they will state that. But let's say that it's out of policy. Let's say the officer violated one of the policies. If that happens, they will note the policy that the officer violated. That will be reviewed by the internal affairs chain. And then once they review it, it will eventually go down to our disciplinary review office. Inside our disciplinary review office, it's a smaller office, and their main function is to review the IA investigation and see what the charges are. And then they are the ones that compare those charges to the history or the control card of the officer, in which we look at past discipline to see what the officer was involved in. This particular discipline happened. And so we have a code of conduct. We have a matrix system that we use when it comes to discipline. So when the disciplinary review officer reviews the discipline, then he would look at the control card and he would match that up in order to determine what the officer's punishment would be. And the basics of that matrix system is there because we want discipline to be fair so that everybody is charged in the range in which they should be charged in, and there's no favoritism left in it when we work with the matrix system. And then once that process is done, he or she will send a recommendation up to the chief. And once the chief gets that, he has the final say on what discipline will be. He will sign off on that. And then once he sends it back, that disciplinary review office will administer that discipline to the officer. And then, of course, like everything else, the officer has grievance rights. The only difference, though, in excessive force investigation, which involves death, and whether that be by discharge of a firearm or any other kind of death that an officer involved in, and a citizen or a subject has died, that investigation is done by a different team within inside of the Major Crimes Division. And this team, they go investigate all in custody deaths, is the best way to put it. And they will go out, they will do the same process as IA, but since they are more versed in investigating death out of homicide, this particular investigation is out of there. And the same process is had. Once that's done, it goes over to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for review, and then it comes back to us. And then once we reach that administrative side on this type of investigation, then the administrative side, that part of it will be by internal affairs. But the criminal on this will be handled on the side. And in looking at that and narrowing it down, we look at our tracking system. So we have a warning tracking system, and it's based on job performance. And we have certain parameters in there, and use of force being one of them. And this tracking system what it does, we don't use it as discipline, but we use it as a way to know that an employee had several accidents, they had several uses of force, the officer will be flagged, a report is done and sent out to the officer's supervision. They're required to sit down with the officer, have a conversation about the three, questionable incidents they were involved in, to make sure that they don't need or they're not additional issues that are happening in or going on. There's no stigma attached to it. It's just our early warning system in which we try to prevent problems before they possibly will happen. And that is kind of a little overview of what I wanted to talk about. Carol Adams stepped in, and she went up some of the, not all of the community things we deal with.
Okay. So we wanted you all to know that we have an entire division that's dedicated to the community, and it's called CYS to Us, Intervention Services. And the Richmond Police Department established it to interact with the communities and inform all personnel that they're responsible for achieving the department's community relations objectives, and to improve our customer service and develop and growth of crime prevention theory and practice. And so the purpose of this unit was to establish liaisons, and that's for the community care unit. And that's within community organizations. And most of you all out there have worked with us to some degree, but it was to bring the business, commercial, governmental, and other community groups and sector precincts together to be able to transmit information back and forth. And so the scope of it was to target programs by crime type and geographic areas based on the basis of analysis and local crime data. And we just wanted to share some of the different programs that we have, which Deputy Chief Collier talked about, the Police Athletic League, and some of the programs are Biddy Ball, soccer clinics, lacrosse, flag football, boxing, spring camp, summer programs, and we even have a Police Athletic League band. Some of our middle school programs, Mirror Me, Bouchard Beauties, Police Explorers, and different academies. We also have Virginia Rules Camp, where we host once a year, and it's 1 week, and we usually take about 100 middle school students, where we have them camp. We do hiking, camping, archery, and a lot of different type of activities. We host youth academies. That's Latino. We have the juvenile justice. We decided to partner with the juvenile justice system to go in and to engage youth while they're inside of the detention centers. We also have a partnership with Bonaire where we're doing the exact same thing. And then we also hold adult citizens academies, which is something we would like to offer you all also. And that's the opportunity where Chief Brand, we went through some of the programs, but that way you can understand the dynamics of the police department, and you'll be able to ask questions about how we do and why we do certain things, and they will be able to provide you with more information. But we also have the young adult police commissioners, and that's where we have high school students come in with us, and they engage the police department's command staff. They assist with decision makings, and they provide insight to us from their perspective as young people. We also have badges for baseball. We do a lot of spring camps. We have our volunteers in policing, where we have seniors that come in and they volunteer their time and to assist with us, badges for baseball. We created after school programs. And we're saying these things to let you all know some of the things that we've designed. And that's just out of our own efforts and with no funding, but we pulled all the partners together, like for our after school program that we started at George Mason's school. And after we did that for a year, the principal came and told us that the reading level for those kids increased 2 levels the entire time we had them and that we were working with them. And we also have supported individuals like Ray Neville's basketball camp. We have a Richmond Police Department bike ride where we give away about 100 bikes in the community throughout the cities, sometimes in the East End and sometimes in Gilpin Court. And our RPD summer internship where we have students to come here and they come to work every day to hang out with us. So they're learning how the department works, and they're going to business meetings with me and just a lot of different things. Shop with a Cop. Christmas sponsorship is where we spend our own money to provide Christmas support to the youth that we work with. Again, we talked about the juvenile detention program, which has worked really, really great. Juvenile traffic academies, where we're teaching kids that are just learning how to drive, the rules of the highway and the rules of engagement. And then we also created something called LIFE, and that's Law Enforcement Intervention Focused on Education. And that was designed through a partnership with Richmond Police and VCU Medical Hospital. And this program was designed because so many young people were being impacted by violence. And we wanted to sort of like create and stop that gateway for them to go into the system, into the system. And that was when they did the report, the minority, what was it? The disproportionate minority contacts through school resource officers. And when we looked, we were leading the way here in Richmond. And so we had to take a step back and do an assessment and say, wait, this is not what we want to be doing. So we created this program so that we could intervene. So we work with juvenile court system so that this is a diversion program. So instead of the youth being charged, having to go to the court system, they would come and participate in the LIFE program. And when they completed the LIFE program, then the charge would be dismissed or it would be diverted. So it wouldn't even show up on their record. And LIFE is 9 weeks. We graduated up to 64 student youth in 2018. And we also have partnered with Richmond RVA League for Safer Streets. And that's a program with 3 young men, 2 of them are returning citizens. And the other young man is a version of Midnight Basketball, Robert Morris, who's a part of this, this task force. And that's working with individuals who have been impacted by the community and who would say that, you know, at one point in time, they were out in the street and they were causing trouble, but then they wanted to change things and they wanted to be a part of the change. And we've been hosting that program for the last 3 or 4 years. And throughout that program, we have groups from Mosby, Whitcomb, Creighton, young men from the ages of 17 to 34 that come together to play basketball under the same roof, where people would say that that was not possible. And that has been happening with, I think, a capacity of 150 to 200 for each season that we host. And we host 2 to 3 seasons a year as much as we possibly can. And then I want to go back to 2014, where, you know, we're talking about policing and we're talking about community policing. But in CYS in 2014, we had over 10,000 contacts doing crime prevention and educational events with the youth. We had over 116 educational activities that we created the same year, and where we had over 15,402 participants, 4 citizens academies with 219 participants. And then when we talk about youth serve, approximately 4,802 in various summer programs, including RBA Rules, Police Athletic Summer League, Young Life, and a variety of others. And so we're going to provide you all with our annual reports, and you can think about how far you would like to go back, but we wanted to provide some insight as to some of the things that we already have in place, and so that we can build on these and start to move forward in this work, and so that we won't spend a lot of time creating something that's already in existence. And I think, Maggie, that's going to be
all right. And we thank this board for the time and allow us to speak and to share some of our stuff with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deputy Chief Collier and Carol, for your presentation. I know that folks have been putting some questions into the chat box, and so what I'm going to do is make sure that I capture those for the use of force subgroup meeting. I also know that a few folks put questions in the chat box about Brian and Sean's presentation. And so I wanted to just quickly, we're running a little bit close on our time here, but I wanted to make sure that if anybody had pressing questions for Sean or Brian, that we have those addressed while we have Sean and Brian on our call today. So if folks want to go ahead and just speak up really quickly and voice their question for them, I just don't want to miss that opportunity, and then we will move to Steve's presentation. let me see here. So I know that, so I think Daryl had a question, and Ram, do you all want to chime in and ask your questions, or Keisha?
Yeah, the question that I had for Dr. Yutzi and Dr. Williams is, what do you say to those who say there's no connection to the past and present policing policies and practices?
Dr. Hudson, would you like to go, or would you
I'm
like
sorry,
to
can you repeat that question again, please? Okay.
Sure. My question was, what do you say to those who say they don't see or they don't see the connection from the past to current
I didn't
policing
can you repeat
policies
that?
and
They
practices?
can't hear me.
You still can't hear me?
All right. I still can't hear you now. One more time. I'm sorry.
Okay. My question was, what do you say to those who say they don't see the connection between the
Yes.
past and current policing policies, practices, and procedures?
Yes. Very good question. I think sometimes the lens from which we view things is always kind of centered in the and used to work. I can by the line from enslavement to now is not that lengthy. It's not that long, and that the dynamics by which relationship
Sean,
evolves.
Sean, I think we might be losing you there.
Sometimes I'm breaking up. Can you hear me now?
Your connection is really poor.
Yeah. I'm in a bad place. I still only have one bar. Brian connection. I'm sorry.
I could try to, I'll share with you my thoughts about it. We all come from different lived experiences, so we have different levels of awareness and appreciation of a lot of these issues. But I think that's the common thread too. How do we get people to become aware, to begin that whole process of understanding and then acknowledging how that past has a presence in the present? And then once we kind of go down that path of awareness, understanding, acknowledgement, we can get to that point of individual and collective compassionate action to begin addressing some of those things. Professor Utzi's presentation really gave us a deep dive into the psychohistorical kind of impact of where we are now, but also how we got to this point. And it might just take time for some to really digest that and appreciate that. But I think the more we reflect upon it, the better we will be able to kind of acknowledge where we are and then kind of engage in that needed action to kind of address where we need to go. Other questions?
I say it's about the presentation you just heard. Hi, this is Carol. Robert has a question. Okay, Robert.
Yes, the question I have, can you all speak on the hiring process? Because I think one of the biggest challenges for the police department is hiring officers that are not equipped mentally, emotionally to be officers. The communities that they work in, that's one of the biggest complaints, is how do these people become police officers? How do they end up with a gun and a badge when it's obvious they can't handle the situations that they find themselves in?
So our hiring practices, and I don't have a copy of them, but I could give you an overview in them. You know, so we do a recruitment process, and our hiring process includes all the things from of course, you have the initial testing that you take. You have to do the written and the physical part to get past that. We have them go through a polygraph, and we ask them the questions in polygraph. We do an in-depth background and investigation, speaking to people they grew up with, their work, their employers, and stuff like that. And then they also come in and they do an interview with our investigators. And we do try to look, and we get applications, and we do weed out a lot of people from the hiring process. So we do think we have a good hiring process, but then everything can be improved. And definitely we want to hear some suggestions, right? Because we definitely have to follow labor law. We're not an individual agency in ourselves. We're still under the umbrella of the city, even though that we're sworn. But we would definitely like to look at any suggestions that you or anyone else have in which you think should be included in the hiring process in order to get someone on. And so you're never going to get an in-depth look totally into an individual through a hiring process, right? So people can put their best foot forward and be who they need to be to get to where they need to be. It's only time that their true self starts to come out and you see the discrepancies, and then we have to weed them out.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Collier. I appreciate that response, and I think we can have a broader conversation about that in the subgroup meeting that's scheduled for next week. But I appreciate that question, Robert, and I appreciate the response. Just want to make sure I'm not missing any other questions. I've been copying and pasting questions from folks related to the police department's presentation, and I'll make sure that those are sent around for folks.
I have a question. Can I ask it? It's a follow-up on Daryl's for Dr. Utsi.
Yes, thank you.
So
I better connect. I'm listening, Rob.
Okay. Given the psycho-historical origins of policing and the current manifestation, the modern day manifestation, going back to like the Black Panthers to now, of police brutality, what are some ways to address the racial trauma, especially in communities of color and in the Black community, by this pernicious relationship?
That's a good question, and that relates to trauma in general. As a clinician, I think one of the things we encourage people to do with regard to previous trauma is to confront the trauma. You have to have an honest reconciling with the traumatic event or experience. You have to be able to make amends, but required before you can do that is a sense of justice. And I think we often talk about reconciliation without the first part, which is acknowledging that wrong was done and making amends to correct the wrong. Many times we want to jump straight to reconciliation. What policies can we pass? What procedures can we institute? And I think we're missing a big part, which is the psycho-emotional component of the Black trauma that people are responding to. And so I think, as was mentioned earlier about the hiring process, we have to remember that everyone involved around this table, people on both ends of the events we witnessed on TV in terms of police brutality, are human, and they are responding to a lot of unconscious processes. So I don't think any hiring procedure is going to be able to weed out the folks who have a propensity toward violence. I know in New York, they used to administer psychological batteries to recruits. And that would be, in their mind, a subjective way of weeding out folks. But what we found is that those tests were also unfairly eliminating Black people from the process. And so I think that we've always struggled with trying to get the right people on the force. But I think a bigger issue is the culture. And the culture as it relates to the relationship between law enforcement and the Black community. And I think that has to be Invest first.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I saw Lisa and Keisha's hands go up. I just want to make sure that these are questions for Sean or Brian.
Yeah, so I just have a really quick question. I appreciate the theoretical and psychological components that go along with understanding kind of what behaviorally is going on and emotionally what's going on in many of our communities of color. I just want to get your kind of perspective on whether you think these same phenomena occur in other communities of color. I know that, many times we as African Americans are kind of create the fertile grounds to promulgate many of these theories that come out of our areas. So I just want to kind of get your perspective on that.
That's a very good question. And I like to make the analogy of a dysfunctional family. Whether we like it or not, the reality of the United States is that Black people and white people have a long relationship, right? It's almost like a dysfunctional, incestuous family relationship, right? And many of us are actually even biologically related, but we have some rules to our relationship, to this dysfunctional and abusive relationship. There's resistance to talking about the past, right? I don't want to try to bring up the past. There's an attempt to squash that discussion. There is a power differential that cannot be undone in the short period of time of 60 odd years. So this unique relationship between Black folk and white folk sometimes gets lost in the translation when other communities are involved who don't have the same dynamics, right? Now, they are, if you will, more recent members of the family. They don't have the baggage that we have. And so we have unique dynamics that we contend with when we have interactions. And so there's an expectation that for example, when we see people who are abused by the police, the first thing that white folks will say is, well, why didn't he cooperate? If he had just cooperated and didn't talk back, then he wouldn't have shot him. Maybe that's an extreme example, but I've heard that many times. And so there's expectation by white folks that Black folks should know their place and be subservient and not be sassy, if you will, right? And this has a long history, not only in slavery, but in Jim Crow segregation, where speaking up could get a black person killed. And many lynchings happened, not because of raping white women, but for speaking up and objecting to the second-class citizenship. That was sometimes met with violence. And so when we have these encounters, all those dynamics of several hundred years of these power dynamics between Black folk and white folk come to bear. That's not present in some other communities of color. They have more recent relationships. And perhaps my social worker will understand my attempt to kind of look at systems theory to explain this relationship and looking at what we're looking at. So I think it's complex and it's not the same. It's almost apples and oranges.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr.
Right, folks, we are getting close to the 5 o'clock hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve to give us his presentation. One moment,
I will get us done before 5 o'clock. Anything, I'm succinct. I'm Stephen Willoughby. I'm the Director of Emergency Communications for the City of Richmond. And if we could go ahead and go to the next slide once you get there. So the Department of Emergency Communications, we're responsible for answering all 911 calls in the City of Richmond. We're the second busiest 911 center in the Commonwealth and one of the busiest 911 centers in the U.S. per capita in the United States. Many people think that when they call 911, it's the police officer, the firefighter that's going to be responding to their call that is actually answering the call. And no, it's a group of dedicated professionals that work at DEC. Next slide, please. So we answer all the 911 calls, and then we're responsible for dispatching those 911 calls, as well as tracking the resources for police and fire, as well as some other agencies. We're also responsible for the technology inside the 911 center, and to some degree out in the field that is used in the city. So to make sure on the next slide, to make sure that we all have the same point of reference when we start talking about what a call for service is so to help you envision what the 911 center looks like, there are 15 to 25 people in a communication center, and they have a bunch of screens in front of them that have resources with them. One of the things I want to point out is of the 15 to 25 people, staffing depends on, I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of background. Is it me?
Could everyone just make sure you've muted your phones or your computers? We're getting a little bit of feedback here. Thank you.
Of those 15 to 25 people, staffing depends upon when the time of day and how busy we projected the calls being. There are individuals that are assigned just to answer in non-emergency calls. They take those calls in, they enter them into the computer system, and then if you go to the next slide, the dispatcher, the police and the fire dispatch those resources. What the radio dispatcher is responsible for is dispatching those calls, tracking the resources and the status and the availability of those resources. I've heard the analogy used for a dispatcher as being sort of a traffic controller. They're keeping track of who's where and what they're doing. So let's talk about calls for service on the next slide. So in 911 calls and non-emergency calls, so total, we received 390 total telephone calls into the Department of Emergency Communications, and there's a breakdown of emergency versus non-emergency calls. I want to say that this is based upon the line that it comes in on. So emergency means it came in on 911, non-emergency means it came in at 646-5100. Sometimes we get 911 calls that are not an emergency, and sometimes we get emergency calls on what we call the non-emergency line. It's being answered by the same people, and based upon the information that they receive, they generate a call for service. On the next slide. So there are 421 types of call types that we use. So when we enter into the system, the dispatcher has 421 choices of how they're going to classify these calls. Now, of these 421, 139 of those call types require a police department response, a response by the Richmond Police Department. And what we do with these call types is it's pre-canned into the computer system based upon the type of call it is it in progress? We've pre-canned all of these. So the call type determines the priority of the response, what agencies respond. So an example would be a car accident where there's an entrapment and somebody is injured. Well, that would require police, fire, and EMS to respond to that, as opposed to a fender bender in a parking lot. It also determines what types of units respond to those calls. So many times it's a precinct unit that responds to a call, but depending upon the priority, it determines which precinct or any precinct unit that responds to a type of call. Something I do want to point out is a communications officer does have a duty to act. So when somebody calls 911 and tells us that they need help, then we have an obligation to send some type of help, to send help. We now have knowledge of that, and we're responsible for rendering assistance. And part of what our protocols and how we do that determine if it's police help, fire help, EMS help, what type of help is needed. But we have an obligation to make sure that they get help of some sort. On the next slide. So of all those calls for service that we entered in, and I'm talking in fiscal year 2020, and for those of you that don't work in government, fiscal year, what we're looking at is July 1st of 2019 through June 30 of 2020. And so that gives us some pretty real numbers. I mean, it's coming up on a little over a month old information now, but it gives us a great capturing of what we're looking at. So there are 201,907 calls for service just to the Richmond Police Department. Next slide, please. So we look at those. Sort of give you some capture of what the most common call types are. So those 140 call types, I sort of classified them into certain types of incidents to help bring this to bite size for everyone. So of those, 27,908 of those calls were officer initiated incidents. This is where an officer witnessed something and initiated a call for service. So these were not 911 calls. These were officer initiated incidents. Of the ones that were 911 calls or came in on our non-emergency lines on the next slide, some of the top ones that we received is 18,000 of those were disorderly persons. What is a disorderly person? Fortunately, many of those calls, of those 18,000 calls, examples are like homeless person that's outside of a business, or somebody in a business that is creating a ruckus, or some type of the disturbance in the business. So it is a wide range of some type of disorderly conduct that is occurring, and based upon what the caller is telling us, we prioritize that call. Is it simply a nuisance call, or is this where somebody is getting ready to fight with someone else? Then the next number is 13,759, and those are domestic disputes, and those can range from anywhere from a domestic fight that is in progress to simply wanting a police officer to stand by while they gain their belongings from a residence that they shared with someone else. 13,622 vehicle accidents or crashes. Again, those can range from an injury accident or an entrapment, all the way down to somebody backed into a parked car in a parking lot. And again, those are categorized associated, but I'm kind of pulling these all together to give you a sense of the types of calls that we receive for police service at DEC. 11,004 alarm calls. These are, panic address alarms, audible alarms, holdup alarms, and these can be generated by both alarm companies who are calling saying, we've got an alarm at this location and we need the police, or the public saying, hey, there's an alarm going off at this business or this residence, and which generates that type of call. A little over 9,000 larceny calls. Those shoplifting would be an example of shoplifting in progress. Another example is, hey, my cell phone was stolen. That would be considered a larceny and would generate a call for service for larceny. Some other call types that we thought that the group would be interested in are on the next slide. Suspicious activity, 10,223 of suspicious activity. This is kind of a wide range of suspicious package, a suspicious person, a suspicious vehicle. Somebody calling 911 and saying, hey, something's just not right in their opinion of a person or a vehicle, or hey, there's a package here that shouldn't belong there. And that's generating a call for service for suspicious activity. Mental subjects, 6,500 of mental subject calls. Those range from individuals having a mental health crisis, or a crisis line calling us, asking us to check on, to have the police department check on someone, to temporary detention orders that are issued by the courts that RPD responds to. 1,600 drug offenses. These are somebody's on the corner selling drugs, or my next door neighbor is smoking weed. And it can really range on what the drug offenses are, but they're associated with, or the primary complaint is related to a drug offense. 1,400 overdoses. Typically, these are originally EMS calls or start off as EMS calls, and it is revealed that this is potentially an overdose that prompts police being added to the response to an overdose call as well. A good deal of that is simply because on those type of incidents, and there are several other incidents as well, depending on the type of call, fire and EMS want the police on scene to make sure that the scene is secure before they will enter. So going to the next slide, that encapsulates some of the calls for service that I think this group will be interested in looking at, as well as some of our top calls for service. We've got all kinds of data that we'll be able to assist the task force in doing. I didn't share with you today, but we've put all calls for service into a mapping software, so we're able to manipulate that map and look at certain areas, look at certain types of calls, but really help the group data mine into what calls come into 911 and what calls are dispatched to Richmond Police Department, as well as other public safety agencies as well.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that presentation to the task force. And I'm sure that we have folks with questions for you that we will address in our subgroup meetings next week. So I appreciate everyone's times, and I will make sure that I'm going through this chat after our meeting concludes, and I've been copying and pasting your questions throughout. So I appreciate everyone's patience with us today as we explore technology in the middle of a pandemic and a working task force. So now the next item on our agenda today was to just talk about next steps for subgroups to make sure that we're all on the same page. So earlier this week, I emailed everyone their preferences for subgroups in a Word document with the self-selected co-chairs for each of those subgroups. If you did not receive that for any reason, please let me know. But I believe I have seen the co-chairs of those subgroups reaching out to folks to schedule your first meeting next week. So please let me know when those dates have been finalized so that I can make sure that the support from the administration is there for you all and can provide that information that you need to begin your work. Do any of the co-chairs of those subgroups or anyone else have any questions as it relates to those subgroups?
Hi, Maggie. This is Tori Edmonds. I'll be scheduled next Wednesday at 3 p.m. by Zoom, and the link has already gone out.
Great. Thank you, Tori. Any other updates from subgroup co-chairs?
Yeah, I spoke with Virgie yesterday. We're going to send out a doodle poll and schedule our first meeting next week.
Great. And Daryl, your question in the chat, is there a way we can get the answers to the questions asked from the task force? Do you mean like in a Word document? Daryl, sorry, I'm not sure if you heard me. Sure, okay, thank you. Just wanting clarification on what that meant.
And Maggie, can I ask a question real quick, since Mr. Willoughby is still right here? And he can either submit it later or answer it later. I just wanted to make sure it was out there. When you look at your calls for service, how labor intensive would it be if other options were added, right? Whether it's mental health crisis, just on down the line, how labor intensive is that for your people that serve? And again, I don't want an answer right now, but just I want to put that out there so we can get that handled down the road.
Well, and I could kind of quickly answer that. Is we depend heavily upon technology and pre-designed response plans. And so the example I used earlier with a injury accident that has a rolled over vehicle, based on the call type that we enter in, the computer system helps define who's going to respond to that. So based on protocols, we pre-design in the technology and we type in the code in there and verify the address. The computer system helps us make those decisions. And so we try to automate as much as we can, where we're not having to make some decisions on the fly, where we've made those decisions beforehand through policies with our responding agencies. And so it requires a lot of time on the front end, but once we build it into the computer system, then it becomes routine.
Are there any other questions related to logistics or meetings or the presentations or next steps that folks have now? I know we're reaching close to our 5 o'clock end period. Just wanted to check in.
Maggie, I have one. This is John Lindstrom with Richmond Behavioral Health. And I just wanted to let everybody know that we are clearly available to bring informational resources to any of the work groups. And how will the mechanics work in terms of notifying myself or any of the other support agencies on behalf of the administration to lend our assistance?
Sure. So if subgroups request those presentations, then I will be the one to liaise between folks like yourself.
Thank you.
Maggie?
Yes.
Maggie, this is Ellen Robertson. I appreciate all of the information that has been presented today. Just one request to Stephen as it relates to the volume of requests that you receive in the mapping. Is there a site where we can go to? One of the things that we've always been concerned about over-policing in some neighborhoods, and I think getting some mapping that shows where the majority of those calls are actually coming from that you've shown us, which is a huge number, may help a lot in us assessing where your needs are actually originating from.
So Ms. Robertson and Mr. Jones, my appreciation to you in this year's budget approving an additional position that was a GIS or Geographical Information System Manager. And so us filling that position has allowed us to look at FY20's data and put it into GIS. And so we're working now where it'll be real time of where that data will be into a database. And ultimately, we can provide that data or sort of walk you through that data, but ultimately I would like to see that information online as well.
Thank you. That'd be extremely helpful.
Any other questions?
Maggie, can the question be to the chief, being as though it's a yes or no question in terms of whether or not any shape or form with the presentation that Dr. Utsi gave us, is that utilized at all with the police department in Richmond?
Deputy Chief Collier or Chief Smith, I'm not sure if you're still there.
I'm still here. I kind of need more. What question directly are we saying?
The information that Dr. Utsi and Brian gave us in terms of the history of police and the of the way specifically Black men and boys may dress, just everything that Dr. Utsi talked about, any part of it. That's why I asked that any shape or form of what Dr. Utsi gave us in his presentation, is any of that used in any kind of training with Richmond Police Department?
So yeah, we do implicit bias training. We do diversity. We bring people in from the outside into the inside to teach those courses to our officers. as far as the content, I can't say that direct content is used in the teachers, but we do touch on those topics.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, folks. That is going to, without any other questions from folks, because I know I see questions coming in on the chat. If for some reason the chat gets cut off at the end of this meeting, please feel free to email me your questions so that I can make sure that they get to the right folks. But otherwise, thank you all so much again. Thank you, Sean and Brian and Deputy Chief Collier, Carol, Chief Smith, and Steve Willoughby for your time and for your presentations tonight. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone on this task force for, again, dedicating 2 hours of their time on a Friday at the end of a week to this work and to this, providing solutions, working forward for our community here in the city. So I appreciate all of you again for joining us tonight. And Daryl and Carol, I don't know if there are any last, as our co-chairs, any last words that either of you have for the group today?
No, Maggie, I'm good. I just wanted to make sure that if there's anyone else having technical difficulties, because Robert still had some issues logging on, just please send us an email so that we can correct that.
I will do.
And I don't have anything additional. Everyone, if you have questions, like I said, we'll try to get those answered. And I look forward to seeing y'all in a few days.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Appreciate your time, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you. You also.
Have a great weekend.